4 dead in Ohio.
Kent State Massacre forces President Nixon to reform policies in Vietnam. Good morning, students. Today's lesson will be about the Kent State Massacre in May 1970, almost 42 years ago. The reaction to the revolution was huge because the students were protesting against the Vietnam War. But right now, we're going to start a few days earlier, on April 30th, 1970.
President Nixon?
Why, hello.
What are you doing in my classroom?
Well, I'm here to talk to you about the events leading up to Kent State.
Oh, like how you referred to the protesters as bums?
Well, initially, I didn't think that anyone who heard my comments at the Pentagon, or who heard the tape recording of it, had any doubt that when I referred to the bums burning up the books and blowing up the campuses, I was referring to the arsonists at Kent State, Berkeley, Yale, and bombers like them. The Washington Post headline the next morning accurately reflected my meaning. Nixon denounces campus bums who burn books set off bombs. However, the front page headline of the New York Times conveyed a slightly different meaning. Nixon puts bums label on some college radicals. Within a few days, it was the widespread impression I referred to all student protesters as bums.
So I can imagine it must have angered the protesters further.
Of course, the National Student Association called for my impeachment, and editors from 11 Eastern colleges, including most Ivy League schools, ran a comment editorial in their campus newspapers calling for a nationwide academic strike.
Wow.
I know, but no one at the time was prepared for what was to come.
So, Mr. President, what initially started the revolts?
Well, when I gained the presidency, I created the program of Vietnamization, where I steadily removed the number of U.S. ground troops while still training the South Vietnamese to defend their own.
But how did that anger the protesters?
Well, at the same time, I had escalated U.S. airways over North Vietnam, bombing their supply of infiltration routes to Cambodia. But when this action failed, I decided to invade Cambodia.
Oh, so that must have meant that more kids were going to be dying in the war, so that's why the students were angry.
Of course. But it had also been the only war in which the draft was put into effect, as well as the average age of the soldier was only 19.
So that must have been why you were accused of bringing the war home.
Of course. For when the protests turned bad, I was the one criticized for it. But by invading Cambodia, I had planned to use Cambodia as a bargaining tool to end the Vietnam War. But I knew there would be both military and political risks. And since I took those risks, I do assume full responsibility for them. And I can say it was one of the worst events of my presidency.
What's happening?
My name is Leon Smith, and I was called to the Kent State campus with the National Guard on May 2nd, 1970, when 2 students threw lit flares into the Army ROTC building and burned it to the ground. A few days later, the students started getting really crazy, so we shot into the crowd.
Wait, why would you shoot at the protesters?
Well, at first things were going fine. Then the students started throwing rock sized softballs at us. So at first we threw tear gas, and the students threw canisters right back at us, so we got the order to shoot into the crowd.
Why would you shoot into the crowd? They didn't even have any weapons. They weren't doing anything.
We did what felt was necessary. It's not our fault.
But 9 students were seriously injured, and 4 were killed.
Well, we didn't actually hurt anybody. But it's their fault for not leaving when we told them to and gave them orders to leave the campus. After the events, 8 guardsmen, including myself, were put on trial for what had happened.
When?
This was 4 years later, in May of 1974. At first, we couldn't believe it. It wasn't our fault. It was Governor Rhodes, the university administrators, and our commanding officers' faults for putting us in those vulnerable positions in the first place.
But was it really? Because there wasn't any massive rush of students towards you, and all of the students were at least 60 to 600 feet away, and 2 of the 13 people shot were shot in the front.
Well, some people believe this to be true, but our defense attorneys, C.D. Lambert, Bernard Slavinsky, and Ed Wright, were actually able to poke holes in the arguments of the prosecution on trial. And get this, one of the witnesses for the prosecution was John Cleary. He was one of the injured protesters. On trial, he admitted that he had been under intensive medication when he gave his original statements in 1970. It was so funny to see him panicking under pressure when he realized his statements were therefore invalid.
That must have been embarrassing for the prosecution.
You got that right, kid. And later that day, the judge told the prosecution that they should have a defense argument ready, because if we asked for an acquittal, then they would most likely grant it.
You guys were acquitted? But you were guilty. You shot.
Hey! I said it once, and I'll say it again. It wasn't our fault.
But...
No! We were put in those vulnerable positions, which is why the next day, we were acquitted.
This is unbelievable. Why were they acquitted?
I understand what you're feeling. Most of the people in the United States felt the same way. They felt that a conspiracy had occurred, for the prosecutor Murphy did not use all the information that was available to him. For in the FBI report, in which he helped to write, it was reported that 6 guardsmen said that their lives were not in danger. This included 2 sergeants and a captain, but yet none of them were called to the witness stand.
So, what was your reaction?
Well, on May 4th, I had received the news that the 4 students had died from my chief of staff hitting me. Of course, I was stunned. Once I received their names, I wrote personal letters to each of the families, even though I knew words couldn't help.
But I still don't understand. Why were they acquitted?
Well, it had to do with the disadvantages that Murphy faced. For he was only able to interrogate James McGee, one of the 8 guardsmen on trial, for the others had pled the 5th. As well as, each of the defense attorneys got to give their defenses separately, which meant they had 3 times more to give their defense than Murphy did to give his prosecution.
Well, that's just really unfair.
I know. James Russell, who was one of the injured protesters, was later quoted saying, "I found out that day that the legal system is not the justice system."
I agree.
However, I had to carry out my plan with the invasion of Cambodia.
Was it successful?
It was, and when it became apparent, various parades were organized in my support. One man even said to me, "Mr. President, if someone would have had the courage to go into Cambodia sooner, they may have captured the bullet that took my son's life."
Wow. Sounds like people were starting to think of you as a hero rather than what they said about you before.
I know. And in January of 1973, I had reached a peace agreement with Vietnam. We, the U.S., would remove all our troops, while all the prisoners of war would be released, as well as there would be no more military activity in Laos and Cambodia, and that the 17th parallel would remain to that in Vietnam. And at midnight of January 27th, 1973, all the shootings.
The reaction to the revolution was huge. Famous singers and songwriters composed songs specific to the events at Kent State, including Ohio by Crosby, Stills, and Nash & Young. Carolyn, are you sleeping in my class?
What? No.
Well then, can you tell me what happened as a result of the revolution at Kent State?
Sure. The reaction to the revolution forced Nixon to reform his policies in Vietnam, and in January of 1973, all the troops had finally been removed.
Wow, that's exactly right. Everybody in the United States was so happy to have the longest war we'd ever experienced.
But the lives of the 4 law students from May 4th, 1970 will never be forgotten.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was in college during those years. Yeah. We had a big demonstration to go to the ministry building. So yeah, very familiar to me. Do we need a moment to
Yeah.
look at these? If you don't mind.
You guys want a breakdown?
All right.
Yeah. No, not breakdown.
Breakdown.
the set.
Breakdown. The set.
Actually, I'd like to look at some of the photos for Jonathan.
Hold on.
Take a look. 7 photographs of 4 victims.
I have one question about Slade. Did she have,
Yes, in the picture here of Mary Baticho leaning over Jeffrey Miller, taken by John Philo, her shirt actually says slave, and
I
that's
was
where...
curious because otherwise, why would you wear that?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. How did you choose to have President Nixon show up in a class?
Well, we felt like Nixon was definitely significant in this, of course, because, Cambodia. But it was kind of hard to figure out a way to incorporate it, because, you have the protester and then the National Guardsman, but Nixon's just on his own. So then we came up with this idea with one of our teachers at school, that what if we actually were in a classroom, and the kid, travels back in time. And then he meets Nixon, and because Nixon, of course, knows all of the things behind it. He knows about the trials. He knows about like things that normal people wouldn't know. So he is educating the student.
And the thing about going back in time is that if we were to just focus on the one day, we wouldn't be able to talk about what happened in the trials.
The reaction.
So,
That would have launched you into.
yes.
I have to say, I think the ploy was brilliant, and not only in you starting out as the boring, humdrum, deadly kind of mystery, no, you know, where you make the characters come to life, but also the argument that the two of you had when you challenged a president as a student and as a history teacher, the passion that we have about it. History is an argument. Ask any history teacher and they will tell you, history is an argument, and you just elucidated that so absolutely perfectly. So you presented both point and counterpoint. Nixon thinking he's the hero, and what, and I was barely in finished college in December of '69, so this was right on the verge when we had demonstrations at State College too, and it struck us so, it cut us to the core, because it could have happened anywhere. It could have happened at Rhode Island College, at URI, any of the state colleges, because we were people looking for answers to why our friends were all being drafted, and Nixon being, of course, the first to influence.
One thing that Nixon did that the students had what was called student deferments. I had a student deferment. If you went to college, you didn't get drafted. Nixon ended that. Which you can, oh yes.
I didn't know that.
Oh yes.
I knew about the people moving to
Aren't
Canada.
you glad you had all this old history?
I know.
So that happened.
Talk to the oldsters. They'll give you the
That
personal
happened
spin on it.
That happened after Kent State, and that's also something that's maybe could be woven in why students didn't like Richard Nixon. I just want to talk a little bit about the performance. It's a very, very clever device of going back into a dream, etc. That was a really good way to get into it.